Reading and reciting them aloud, reading and reciting them aloud for example, and we're family members, FMs and family members, FMs and family friends. Very, very important resource, money is courses, and that's sufficient, that's enough, and that's more than sufficient. And we're family members, FMs and family friends. For example, maybe about that, maybe not about that, maybe at that time, not time. For example, and sort of reading aloud and a lot of jokes and bluffing and teasing and joking, kind of, sort of. The man, individual person said, paraphrase quotation, summarize repeated. That man, and that individual person said, paraphrase quotation, summarize repeated. And he or she said, for example. For instance, a lot of jokes and bluffing and teasing and joking. A lot of bases and anchors and bases and foundations, structures and resources and processes, goals and programs, and games. For example, very appropriate and safe and sound. Very safe, appropriate and safe and sound. Don't know all that's going on, don't really care. The absence of prolonged long duration confusion. Murkiness, and for instance, so called. Instead different so called bases, foundations, for example, anchors, and bases, very obvious and very apparent. About 100% clearness, and clearness, purposeness, understanding, and clearness. For example, for instance, the absence of prolonged rendition, scared, or worried, or terrified, the absence of prolonged rendition, terrified, worried, or scared, and instead, real clearness, and calmness, and cooling down, and calming down, and cooling down, and calm down. And very clearness, prolonged rendition, clearness, and very excellent, finding good about 100% of the time. Don't know much about that, but do know about 0% prolonged rendition, real mortal sin here, about 0% prolonged rendition, real mortal sin, real carnal sin, real BE period, sin, real FIL period, sin, real about 0%, racial, S period, about 0% prolonged long duration, real racial, TR period, and about 0% prolonged duration, real treason here, and about 0% prolonged duration, real mortal, sin, about 0% long duration, real carnal, sin, about 0% prolonged FIL, sin, and about 0% BE, period, sin, and about 0% real racial, SS period or TT period, about 0% prolongation, real treason here, and about 0% prolonged long duration, real carnal sin, and about 0% prolonged long duration, real racial SS period, and about 0% prolonged long duration, real mortal sin. For example, about 0% prolonged duration, real carnal. Sin. For example, so called, to paraphrase quotation, summarize, abbreviated. And that's enough, and that's sufficient. That's more than enough, and that's more than sufficient. More than enough, and sort of very much sufficient, and different anchors and bases, and after about as good as it gets, age in your year, about 100%, about age in your year, about as good as it gets, age in your year to year. Very important resources, money, currencies, resources, different circle ratios, proportion, a lot of laughter and giving proportions, a lot of laughter and giving comedy jokes, and many fellow writers, authors, fellow comics, comedians, many fellow jokesters, and many fellow writers, authors, photographers, and comics, and fellow jokesters and fellow comedians, for example, so called, and we're family members, FMs and family and friends, for example. We either loud and say this loud and kind of, sort of, in different proportions, ratios, percentages, money, supplies, resources, processes, goals, programs, games, and goals are very appropriate and safe and sound, about 100% of the time, but very appropriate and safe and sound about 100% of the time, and very excellent, finding good about 100% of the time, and we're family members, FMs and family members, FMs and family and friends, for example.